Hello there! I wanted to make a little video here on how I set up TotalMix for surround sound workflows and I guess the setup of it in general, and making it a bit more easy to look at and not as crazy, because this is a little crazy. So first thing, you want to make sure you have your driver installed for your RME interface. You have your MIDI face settings installed. It might come with TotalMix, I'm not entirely sure. I have this as initialized as I could make it for the sake of doing this video, but I have to have some things set up just for the sake of recording. First thing we want to do before we address this is we want to go to MIDI face settings and open that up. And think of this as your overall control over how your interface is working and how your computer is going to be talking to it. Here you can set your buffer size. Then the next important bit that you want to look at is over here where it says WDM device. And by default, it's going to be set to stereo, but you want to set this to multi-channel so that Windows will see this as a multi-channel output device. And then you want to go to WDM settings, open that up. And then you want to make sure that whichever analog inputs and outputs you want to be using from your interface into your computer, that those are checked. And what this is essentially doing is setting up an audio driver that Windows is able to see and communicate with. In my case, my microphone is going to be plugged into analog 9, which is why I have that selected. And analog 1 to 8 are going to be my main 8 outputs. Hit OK once that's done. And you'll notice that if you go to your Windows sound settings, you'll be able to select those outputs that you just set up in the WDM device. I can see I can also set analog 9 and 10. There's a little headphone icon because physically outputs 9 and 10 would be a headphone output on my interface, but I just have that set up so that it's also the input, not just the output. The settings you have here at this point will be very dependent on which RME interface you have. I, for example, have the UFX3, and there are a lot of different channels on that thing, and I want to be getting rid of it. But if you have, say, something like a Babyface that has only 2 channels, it's going to look very different. So once that's done, we're going to hit OK. And first thing we want to do before we get into doing anything is, as a safety, so we don't accidentally blow our ears or speakers or anything by routing audio, is here where it says main, you want to turn this all the way down to negative infinity. And we'll do the same thing for our analog outputs. I'll just do the first couple here. And these 8-at, so on and so forth. I'll get into this in a moment. So now that those are down, we can start doing our initial configuration and setup of TotalMix. But before we do that, I think it's very important that we clean up this because this is a little crazy to look at. How this is laid out is essentially your physical hardware inputs to your interface, like microphones. They'll show up here. If you have 8-at connections, they'll show up here, and so on and so forth. This middle row is going to be your software playback outputs. And these are the things that, say, Reaper or Pro Tools or whatever are going to be recognizing and using. The bottom row is your physical outputs to your interface. Like if your interface has XLR outputs, those are going to be showing up here. Now, what makes TotalMix and RME interfaces a little different to others is that you can decouple and remap where the software outputs and the hardware outputs are going, which is very, very handy for setting this up for surround that we'll get to in a little bit. In most interfaces, the software output is automatically going to the corresponding hardware output, but we're going to be breaking that soon. Now to clean this up, we want to go to Options. You want to go to Channel Layout. And here you can see all your available input, playback, and output channels. What we can do is we can select everything we're not using. For example, not using any of the MIDI outputs, not using ADAT or AES. Inputs. And you can select hide channel in, mixer, and matrix. And I'm going to do the same thing for playback and output. Okay, cool. Immediately, much more usable to look at. That was crazy. So a quick rundown of how a channel works in RME. At the very top, you have the name. These are going to be auto-named to what type of physical input or output connection it is. I have my analog, then I have my 4 mic pre's. If you double click on the top here, you can rename what the name of that channel is. Below that, you have a stereo balance panner, which basically means that if this is turned all the way to the left, the right signal is not being moved to the left channel, but it's instead being muted Think of it like a balance mixer between how much of the left you want to hear and how much of the right. If I move this, it's to the right, it's not going to take the left signal and move it to the right. It's going to be muting the left signal, which is very handy for some things you want it to be doing soon. Below that, we have our mute and solo buttons. And then here we have a funky little fader that will send to your interface's built-in effects. If it has that, you can access that by clicking on this little effects button over here. Below that, you have a T that, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what this does. I haven't had a use for it yet, so I'm just gonna ignore that. And then below that, you have a gear, and this is where you can configure how your channel is functioning. If you have a microphone plugged in, say if I go to my mic pre's, you can see you can turn on phantom power. You can set if it's gonna be an instrument, unbalanced input. You can set your gain level, your effect send level, same thing as this little fader here. You can set auto set gain, which is gonna dynamically change the volume of the gain based off how loud it is. I haven't really experimented with that, but some people might be into it. You have a width control. You have mid-side processing, if that's something you want to do if you're recording in mid-side. And then you have polarity invert for the left and right channels. Now at the very top, you have a stereo button. And if you click that, you can decouple the left and right channels from being linked to being two independent channels, which is very handy. So if you have a bunch of microphones plugged in, you don't want them to be stereo, but you want them to be mono, you can just turn off stereo and now there'll be two mono channels. And that applies for the software and hardware outputs as well. Finally, we have an EQ and a dynamic section that we can turn on or off, which can be handy. And in the MIDI face settings, you can actually turn on a EQ and dynamic record. Another quick thing while we're here that I want to touch on is you can select limit ASIO to 32 channels, which may help with certain applications that may not like talking to your RME device. Sometimes if applications aren't behaving properly, you can limit this to being 32 channels if your interface has that many channels. It may not be applicable if you have a smaller thing like a MIDI face, but if you do have a lot of outputs and you're running into issues, this might be a nice thing to just check and see if that fixes your issue you're running into. Now for routing, what we can do is if you click on any of the outputs here at the bottom row, you'll notice that the software outputs will automatically change their fader volumes, and think of these as sends to that output. So if I select analog 3 and 4, whatever fader is turned up over here for software playback is going to go to 3 and 4. So if I turn up 5 and 6, Reaper output 5 and 6 is going to go out of my analog output 3 and 4, for example, which will be very useful for setting up some of our alternate mixes that we can listen to and author. So before we get into setting this up for surround sound now, is I want to go and set up some safety and general quality of life things that make this workflow usable. Over here on the right, we have a groups panel, and these are ways of just linking either the mute, solo, or faders between whatever channels you want. So if for example, I want to create a little panic button. Let's say if sound plays really loud, I can just select a mute group and it'll mute all my outputs for me so that they are not being heard anymore, and I just muted everything all at once. To do that, we can click edit, select which mute group you want to edit. So I'm going to say 1. Then I'm going to select the mute button of all the channels I want to affect. Once that's done, I hit edit again. And now whenever I click mute group 1, it's going to mute and unmute all these channels at the same time, which is great. And also we are going to set up a fader group, which will let us link faders together. Same idea. You want to go edit, fader group 1, click on the faders I want to link. I'm going to do all my outputs so that their output volumes will all move uniformly. Turn off editing. Now if I turn up 1, they all move. And you can turn that off just by clicking on fader. So that is the first initial thing I like to do. Your panic button, mute group 1, and fader group 1. What you can also do, I'm not going to get into this for this video, but you can set up MIDI control in TotalMix because everything here can be controlled by MIDI. And even if you have their ARC USB controller, if your interface supports it, it's basically a glorified MIDI controller from RME that just maps automatically to a lot of these things. If I click on ARC commands, these automatically map to snapshots and mute groups and so on and so forth. But you can do any MIDI device you want. I've seen people use an iPad even to control this whole thing, which is pretty sweet. Now, finally, I want to go and look at the snapshots. Now, snapshots are going to be taking how your TotalMix is set up and changing the fader routing, the levels, so on and so forth, all with the click of a button. So you can go from one setting to another. You can have one setting here that's if you're recording using the same mic pre's, maybe same microphone. You can have a snapshot that will set those record levels automatically for you. If you have your favorite headphone levels that you like to set things to, you can have that all saved within a snapshot. Now for my workflow and what I find works for me for surround is to set up a 5.1 snapshot so I can hear the full 5.1 mix. Then I like to have a 5.0, which is your 5.1 mix but without a dedicated LFE channel, so that if I'm working in the night and I don't want the subwoofer going and waking someone up potentially, I can go ahead and select that, and now the LFE is gone. However, I'll get into it, but you can set this up so you can still listen in other speakers what would be going to the LFE, which is handy. I also like to set up just a plain old stereo output that has all the surrounds muted, a stereo +1, which is going to be our LFE extension, and then also a fold down so we can listen to what a stereo fold down over 5.1 mix is going to be. And by the way, this entire workflow and setup, it can scale based off whatever output configuration you want to use. Like if you're going 7.1, 9.1, Atmos even, you can do it all. It's the same idea. You're just changing how many channels you are setting up. I'm just going to do 5.1 because that is what I have. Now, just like with everything else, I can double click on the snapshot name and rename it. And I'm just going to go ahead and name these now based off of the snapshots I'm going to be creating. And again, you can set these however you want. This is just what works for me. So now that my snapshots are named, I can go ahead and start doing the actual setup for these. I want to go to click on my main out. And I just want to make sure that for the main output, that only software output 1 and 2 is go to my main, and I can turn everything else down because I don't want whatever's coming out of software 3 and 4 to go to my main speakers. I want that to go to its own channels. I'm also just going to turn off this mute group for now while I'm doing this. From here, what I'm going to do is for output 3 and 4, I want to click on this gear and I want to decouple them because my center channel and LFE channel are not stereo. They're completely independent of one another. I realize I forgot to mention, but I'm setting this up in a SIMP format where my physical speakers are plugged in a configuration that goes left, right, center, LFE, left surround sound, right surround sound, which is why I'm going to be doing it like this. So I got my left, right, center, LFE, left surround sound, right surround sound. Now, before we get into anything else, if we click on the gear, you'll notice that there's a little like +13 dBu. If you click on that, you get other settings. Now, these are your output sensitivities. I believe that's what the technical word for it would be. Basically, the higher the number this is, the more sensitive that output is to volume. Where if I have this, say, at +24, I have to give more level on this fader to hear it at the same level as +19. And because on my particular interface, all the outputs don't have +24 for the highest amount of sensitivity, which I think also has to correspond with headroom, I'm just going to make sure that these are all set to +19 across the board instead of +13. And maybe +13 is better. Not entirely sure. Don't really want to experiment with it. So now that that is done, we can go ahead and start renaming these outputs. We know what is what. So I know analog 3 is going to be center. And from here, as we click on each of these, you'll notice that these software playback outs are going to map automatically, which is pretty handy. And you'll notice that for center and LFE that there is a +6 boost, and that has to do with pan law and TotalMix's setup. But what we can do instead here is we can decouple the stereo channel for software 3 and 4. So that way we have finite control, which will come in handy in a moment. I'm going to go ahead and rename these as well. So I'll call this left, right for 1 and 2. So main, that's right, center, LFE, that's all set up right. Cool. So this is our basic setup for 5.1. At this point, you could be all done and good. But what I'm going to do first, click store where the snapshot button is, and I'm going to save this setting to 5.1. So whenever I go and click on the snapshot, it's going to remember these settings. Like if I go to 5.0, you can see that the settings have now changed a little bit. Now, if you want, you could go ahead and start calibrating your speakers if you have a way of doing that. Maybe it's an app on your phone. You have maybe an actual measurement microphone or whatever, and you'll usually be playing back, like say a -20 RMS pink noise file that goes to all the outputs. And with the fader group turned off, you can start turning up these speaker levels until they're all reading the exact same volume. What you set this to is going to be very dependent on what speakers you have, how big your room is, so on and so forth. But I know for me, it's like minus 40 for that's like minus 36 for my center, minus 42 for my LFE, something like that. This is off memory. You would actually do this properly instead of guessing like this. But once I have all this set up, I could turn my fader group back on, and it's going to remember the output levels for all these so that they all move together, which is going to be our volume control. And again, this can be controlled with MIDI or whatever you want, really, which is fantastic. So now that that is set up, we're going to store 5.1. You can see it all still saves. And what I'm going to do to save some time is store this on our 5.0 and store this on our 2.0 and store this on our fold down. I'm going to go back to our 5.0 so we can go and change this. Now, like I said, this is going to be like my night mode listening. And I'm just going to mute the LFE. So it's not going to output to that physical speaker. But if I want to author what was being sent to the LFE, I can go back to my main output. And you can see here where center and LFE are. If you double click on the pan knob, I'm going to reset this. And I'm going to turn this up so that whatever would output to channel 4 out of, say, Reaper, it's going to come out of my main speakers as well, which is great for authoring that. And I'm just going to set to what my usual fold down setting would be, which I'm going to get to. But for me, it's going to be minus 6 here for my LFE. I'm going to store that. So now 5.1, we have our full mix. 5.0, LFE is muted, and the LFE channels are now going to the main outputs. So we can still hear what's happening there. You don't have to do it if you don't want. It's just, I find it useful personally. Now for 2.0, we're going to be muting everything but the stereo speaker, because this is a scenario where you don't really care what's happening in the surrounds and you just want to get rid of it, focus on the stereo. Maybe you're designing in just stereo. You don't want all the outputs going. This is handy for that. And simply mute and make sure our main output only has software output 1 and 2. And that's all we have to do. Store that. And now for 2.0 plus 1, I'm going to store this 2.0 setting here as well. Except from here, we're going to unmute the LFE and we're going to turn down the LFE send. Now this snapshot is going to be mimicking what a physical hardware crossover device would be doing, where you have your LFE receiving the same signal as your stereo speakers, but you'll be able to use it as a bass extension of sorts. Maybe your speakers don't go down to the sub range and you want to still hear that 40 hertz or whatever. It's a cool little nifty thing for setting that up. So with 2.0 plus 1 selected, we want to make sure that our stereo output of software set to 0. Set this to my fold down setting as well, and a 6. And now if we go back to our main, make sure nothing else is happening. LFE, still main. Cool. Now to make this work properly and actually mimic what crossover would do is we can turn on the EQ section for our output. If you click on the right band here, third band, you can click on the symbol here to change it from a high shelf to a low pass. And I'm going to set this to 80 hertz. Now the exact frequency, set this here. You can usually just reference what your subwoofer manual says to set crossover points to. I know mine says 80 hertz is generally recommended. It could be 120. It could be whatever you want. Find what works for you. It's going to vary from speaker to speaker. But now that that's set up, we also want to go to our main output, turn on low cut, and set this on. Set this to 80 hertz. And I believe this is more of a 24 dB per octave slope. So I'm just gonna change that setting over here as well. So now our main stereo speakers have a high pass and our LFE has a low pass, so that I'm mimicking a crossover system. So that way only the bass is going to the LFE and everything else is going to the speakers, which is pretty nifty. Go and store this as a snapshot. So now if I go back to 5.1, everything's there. Listen to the stereo. Want to hear a little extra oomph, go to our LFE extension. And now finally, we have our fold down. Now this is going to be setting up a stereo fold down over 5.1 mix. So what we're going to do is mute all of our surround speakers because we do not want to be hearing them. We want to have our main output selected, and we're going to be configuring our software playback outs so that they are sending the full 5.1 mix to the main output, but they're just going to have their levels changed to the fold down settings that we're going to be using. Now these settings, I have seen a few different iterations of it. The one I'm doing is what I've seen most common, but some people may have other thoughts and preferences. Be very curious on what everyone is using. But I'm just going to reset the center LFE pans. And my center channel, I want to make sure this is -3. So I'm turning down the center speaker or the center send by 3 dB. LFE is going to be -6, and my surround speakers are going to be -3 as well. I'm going to store this as fold down. So now if we have our DAW open, we can play back 5.1, but we'll just hear our main stereo speakers, which is very handy. Maybe you're working quad, you want to hear fold down, whatever you want. Set these up whatever works for you. If you have a recorded setup that works for you that you do often, I recommend doing that as well. But then, yeah, that is setting up TotalMix for surround sound and a little overview of what works for me. I hope this is helpful. I'll be very curious if other people have other methods of setting this up that works for them, and I would love to hear it. Have yourself a good one. Cheers.